Hello, everybody. This is the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley. Every week, we are looking to inspire you with cool and interesting thoughts from interesting and fascinating people around the world. And today, we will be talking with Andrew Charman, who is in South Africa. He has studied all kinds of things related to the micro-economies of townships. And I believe that much of what he has to say will be interesting for anyone in Rotary who is thinking about how the different kinds of service projects we do can avoid upsetting existing systems that are important for the livelihoods of the people who are in these areas where we hope to be helpful in some fashion. Andrew was educated at the University of Cape Town and at Cambridge University, and is also the co-director of the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, which I hope we will hear a little bit about as well. If it doesn't come up in the presentation, it'll come up in the questions. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, welcome to the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning and good afternoon to the various members. Today, I'm talking on the topic of unseen micro-enterprises of the South African township economy. I'm going to begin my presentation with a provocation, and I'm going to frame this provocation through a question. The question is, how do unemployed people who receive minimal state support survive economically? Now, this is not simply an academic question, a matter for researchers, but this is really a matter of life and death for millions of South Africans on a daily basis. And the challenge we have in South Africa is that the formal economy, the regulated economy, is growing, but growing very slowly. Despite this low level of growth, the growth is not able to translate into the creation of new formal jobs. So essentially, in 2020, we have the same number of formal jobs in our economy as we had in 2011. This is a very worrying scenario, given that the population of South Africa, like many developing countries, is rapidly expanding. Now, so this means that essentially we have a crisis of unemployment in this country. And the crisis is particularly concentrated in geographic spaces which we refer to as townships. These were the settlements that were established under apartheid and reserved for the occupation of Black residents in urban areas. They tend to be situated on the urban fringes of our cities, and they are under-resourced with various different amenities and services. In these areas, about 40% of the labor force are unemployed. Now, that's particularly shocking when we consider that we have a very different demographic profile to one that you would experience in the global north. Our population is young, and many people are still at school, so the number of unemployed is likely to rise over the next decade or so. I am a co-director of an organization called the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation, based in Cape Town, South Africa. And we seek to respond to these really challenging questions, such as how do unemployed people who do not have formal employment or grants survive economically. We seek to address these questions through undertaking innovative and cutting-edge research, through working with people and communities to understand and get a bottom-up perspective of their development, and then through translating our learning into projects and programs which can have an impact at one of various different levels. We seek to have an influence on policy, and as well as identifying specific interventions through which we can begin to move the needle. We work across a number of spheres, and I in particular focus on the sphere of economic development and of enterprises in particular. Now, in order to answer the question, we are not able to utilize traditional research methods because traditional statistical data sets do not talk about the township economy and the world of micro enterprises or very small businesses. So we have to think out of the box. We've had to start from scratch, so to speak. And to do that, we developed a new research approach, an approach called the small area census. And what the small area census means is that we really wanted to take a fairly small area of each township, which would represent the kind of dynamics that were typical in these environments, and place this area under a sociological microscope. We wanted to peer through the microscope and really try and identify all the different kinds of activities that one would find on the ground if we could look through such a microscope. Now, we called our method a census because we wanted to go out onto the ground and record all economic activities, whether they were large or small, whether they were undertaken in a formal or legal manner or an illegal and informal way. I should point out that most of the businesses that we're dealing with operate informally, and hence, within the context of legal institutions, are informal. However, most of these businesses nevertheless sell goods that have been procured from formal value chains. And in many cases, these are very long value chains. These are not simply value chains within South Africa, but they're selling goods that are obtained across the global economy. So to really get to the heart of our question of how are poor people surviving, we commenced research in 2010, and I'm very pleased to show you a much younger photograph of myself commencing research in 2010, when we set out with some basic research tools, which included a Garmin GPS and a notebook and a camera and a questionnaire. And we started work in an area called Delft. Now, if you ever come to Cape Town and you fly into Cape Town, you will notice as you fly out a community called Delft, a very, very poor community. And we were particularly interested in Delft because it was one of the first post-apartheid townships. It was also one of the first townships that sought to integrate people from different racial backgrounds into a post-apartheid settlement. So we set out to go and record all the business activities within this 2 square kilometer area of Delft. And importantly, we wanted to collect geospatial data. We had a hunch at the time that understanding the precise locations within an area in which businesses take place would be important. We didn't really know quite why it would be important, but we just had a hunch that space really mattered. We also interviewed the businesses because we wanted to know a little bit more about the kinds of businesses that we would encounter and what were some of their enterprise challenges. We have repeated this method numerous times over the years, and the current photograph, once again, I'm in the current photograph, and this was a picture undertaken in 2020 of one of our most recent surveys. We've really evolved and refined the method, and we've learned to build the capacity of local residents to play a key role in collecting data and undertaking this kind of research. Now, the businesses that we studied, we refer to them as micro-enterprises, and of course, the entrepreneurs we refer to as micro-entrepreneurs. Now, the kinds of business we're dealing with are very different to the types of businesses that one would find in the formal economy and the kinds of businesses that are enumerated in typical economic analyses of the business environment. So we developed a new way of categorizing these businesses, a way that describes precisely the kind of activities that we would experience. And in the photographs below, you can see examples of the types of businesses that we encountered in 2010. And you will notice immediately that these businesses operate from a diverse range of spatial situations and have very different kinds of forms. We would find, for example, a greengrocer selling vegetables from a horse and a cart. We encountered a lot of businesses situated on public open space in using old shipping containers, such as the barbershop that you can see. And then we found a range of businesses that were home-based and that were selling a range of goods and services from the confines of a domestic home, such as the example you can see in the photograph, where the business provides game shops, the old arcade games that you probably remember, as well as services such as electricity, etc. And in the icons that I presented in the slide, you can get a flavor of the kinds of businesses we encountered, from game shops to drug dealers to people providing repair services to taverns to restaurants, to recycling, to phone shops, to car washes, to tailors, and to cobblers, just to give you a flavor of some of the businesses we found. Now, I mentioned to you that when we started our research in 2010, we had a hunch that the spatial position of businesses was very important. And this map indicates the distribution of these businesses across the particular area that we studied. I've indicated the high streets, and these are very important. These are the main roads through which public transport would pass in an area in yellow. So you can see the distribution of businesses on a neighborhood basis, as well as the high streets. Well, we found 287 businesses in 2010. Now, at that point in time, the city of Cape Town had identified only about 124 of these businesses on their database. So the bottom line was we had found a whole lot of unseen businesses, particularly businesses that provide food and groceries. Now, I would like to just add that our research indicated that these businesses were scattered so incredibly evenly across the geographic terrain. In fact, it would be very difficult for any one of us to be able to distribute these businesses as evenly as one can see in this particular slide. We revisited the site in two different waves. I'm going to focus on one of the waves in which we resurveyed the site. This happened in 2015. Now, if you recall from the previous map, the businesses were lightly scattered throughout the site. And 5 years later, you can see an incredible densification of business activities. In fact, the number of businesses that we identified just slightly over doubled. Now, bear in mind, this takes place in a context when the formal economy is not growing, is not creating the kinds of jobs that we need to address unemployment. And yet the informal economy is growing, and we're seeing a lot of new businesses emerging, so the diversity of business is improving. We're seeing a new range of businesses that we didn't identify. An important trend that we were able to start to understand was the role of the high street. And by 2015, you can see a greater concentration of businesses along those yellow routes. And so by 2015, around 45%, let's say, of all businesses were now situated on the high street, which is critically important from a policy perspective because it helps to highlight the importance of these streets as an important space for doing business. We were also intrigued to find that the phone shops that we had identified in 2010 completely disappear. And that was a very useful finding for us because it helped to ground truth the research we were doing. Between 2010 and 2015, handsets for cellular phone devices emerged for the first time. And as a consequence, these phone shop businesses completely disappeared. So it was a very, very reassuring finding, even though it meant a loss of business for certain individuals. We also began to see some remarkable dynamics to the spatial distribution of these businesses. And indicated in this particular graphic in the mauve dots, you can see the position of small grocery stores. We call them spaza shops. They might be equivalent to your mini market or your 7-Eleven in the States and elsewhere. And what is fascinating about this research is that these businesses are situated across the map in an incredibly even spatial distribution. And that means that businesses are positioned in neighborhood niche markets. They are serving just a tiny distribution of homes, providing access to goods and services that are needed on a regular basis and provide great benefit to people in these areas. Now, I'm going to focus on some of the learnings from the work that we've undertaken. The first key point is that there were many more micro-enterprises that we were able to identify that are indicated in the statistical record. And this reflects the methodological challenge of studying business and business development in these areas, and the fact that so much economic activity is underreported, and because it's underreported, it's under-recognized. We also found that these micro-enterprises that we had identified were making goods and services much more accessible to people, often more affordable, and in many instances more relevant to people's cultural and socioeconomic needs. Now, we've summed this up in a photograph that you can see. And this is a picture of all the food items that we were able to purchase one morning for less than R1. Now, R1 being the lowest monetary unit that we have in South Africa. So that's less than about 14 American cents. And we found some really surprising items. We found tiny packets of sugar and milk powder and a few chili items and lollipops and unusual mixes of popcorn and tea bags, etc. So this just provides an indication of how the informal economy and micro enterprises can be providing goods on a way that is much more affordable to people's needs and requirements. I'd now like to reflect on some of the implications of the work that we've undertaken. Well, first and foremost, we have learned that entrepreneurship provides the poor, provides people with new forms of agency. Entrepreneurship allows people to acquire new skills. It allows them to build new social networks. And very importantly, it brings a little bit of income into the household. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that many of the businesses that we have studied are poor and are probably likely to remain poor in the new future, into the, not the new future, but the near future. There are many reasons that are holding back the growth of these businesses individually and collectively, and a lot of our work focuses on addressing some of these barriers. We have, however, also found a number of successful entrepreneurs. And some of these entrepreneurs have the X factor. They really have the entrepreneurial drive. But the entrepreneurial drive is often not enough. They have support networks, which include networks through which they're able to access goods and services that are not often available. They receive institutional support. It could be finance, it could be access to license, to be able to pursue their business and to link into value chains. And very, very importantly, the successful entrepreneurs tend to have strategies for addressing some of the key risks that business owners face in these contexts. And one of the big risks in South Africa is the risks of crime. I have put a photograph into the slide because in many ways it sums up this key resilience that we see. And this is a photograph taken actually in Johannesburg of an entrepreneur, a micro-entrepreneur. He's recycling mattresses. So he collects old springs from a dump site, covers them with foam, and then sews them up. Now, onto our conclusions. I think it's very important that we begin to recognize that entrepreneurship provides a development pathway for township residents. It's one of the roads to freedom. It's not the only road, but it is a road that I believe is acknowledged. And I would like to use this opportunity to make a bit of a call on development stakeholders to really recognize and respond to the potential of these small businesses to address poverty in developing countries like South Africa. Not alone, but in conjunction with a number of other interventions. If you'd like to know a little bit more about our work, please feel welcome to engage with our book, Township Economy, People, Spaces and Practices, or you can hear us talk about the book in the Talking Transformation podcast series by Peter Ahmed. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Andrew. There are some questions lining up. I'll introduce who we have on the call real quick. If your camera is on, wave. If not, no need. So here in California, we have Ferheen, we have Cecilia, my name is Rushton. In Germany, we have Jens, and with that, let's open it up to the questions. Cecilia has the first one. Go right ahead.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Andrew. It really sort of brought me right back to the very small town that I worked in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia, and the ubiquity of small enterprises such as the ones you described. It goes without saying in environments like that. So my question is, I have a lot of questions, of course, but because I'm actually working on some economic development projects for that community so that when I go back, can try to help make a difference there. But so who is using this information, and how are you using it? Who's the end user of it, and what are they using it for?
Okay, we're a not-for-profit organization, so all the research we've undertaken, we've made our data and our research findings publicly available. So that some of the data has fed its way into policy dialogue, some of it is being used by students and researchers, and some of it has been used for planning development programs. And currently we're using a similar methodology, similar approach, to develop economic strategies in 5 different communities. And this is part of a national program funded by the national government to support cities to respond to the needs of small businesses. So we're currently in a process of practically applying that information in developing an evidence-based economic strategies in 5 different cities.
Okay, and just quickly, second question, but what you said brought me to this. So is there some percentage of these enterprises that were initiated through microfinance initiatives, or do people just somehow get a little money and start their business, or have skills and start their business?
It's a complicated topic. I think there are a number of different routes through which people enter into business. The access to microfinance is very limited and probably is the smallest of all the routes through which people enter into business. Most people usually mobilize existing resources and assets within their household and therefore would start very small, maybe selling some scones or sweets or whatever resources they have. So that would be one of the pathways that we have identified. Another pathway is commonly that people would mobilize resources within broader family networks. And in the South African case, you would often find examples of people who have jobs that would then fund a family member to start a business. I mean, partly to reduce the financial burden on people with jobs in these communities. So that would be an example of a second pathway. A third pathway would be that somebody might start working for an individual in a business, begin to acquire some skills to build a social network, and then break out and start and set up a business. And this would often happen, for example, in hair salons and barbershops. You know, once you build up a repertoire of clients, it's very easy to break away and take your clients with you. So there are a number of routes through which people would enter the market, and there's not one in particular. But businesses that are driven through an institutional process, such as the provision of finance or technical support, tend to be much smaller, and we've found fewer of them in the work that we've undertaken over the last decade.
Can I ask one more quick one? This one is not so complicated. How many of these businesses were really doing sort of 2 businesses in one location, same family running it? Next door to where I lived, there was an enterprising gentleman who had a barbershop in the front, and in the back he had a generator that ran right next to my bedroom wall until midnight every day, and he was charging cell phones for other people.
You've hit on a very key issue, and that is when we started undertaking research in this economy, we had to learn very quickly that you have to think very differently about what a business is. And often when we come from a developed context, we think of a business as having very particular form, selling particular products in a particular and clearly defined manner. In the informal economy, I've had to learn over the years to think of a business as really an income stream or a set of income streams. So the business today or this morning might be selling X, but really it's actually comprises of a range of income streams, precisely as you've described it. And that makes it very, very difficult to start pigeonholing business in particular categories. And often when the state tries to put business in the categories, in particular categories for purposes of regulation or control or enumeration, it misunderstands that in fact we're dealing with not a single category, but a strategy of obtaining income through various income streams that present themselves.
Thank you.
Excellent. When we think about the research methods that went into this, you had identified a group of businesses, informal businesses, in 2011. You came back, that number had about doubled as of 2015. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of what the reasons are for the increase in businesses? Does that have to do with the population increase? Does it have to do with improved methods on your part? Does it have to do with a willingness on the part of people in that area to engage with you? What is your team's guess as to the principal factors for seeing the increase in businesses from 2011 to 2015?
Look, it might be a methodological issue, though we have discounted that to a certain extent, because when we resurveyed the site in 2020, we began to see the impact of the slowdown in the South African economy. So one of the key learning is that the informal economy is tied to the formal economy. When the formal economy undergoes stress and strain, that stress does pass on to the informal sector. It's not separate, and it doesn't operate on a counter-cyclical basis. So the two are linked. That's very important. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in many of the economies we're looking at, they're starting from a very low base. And so over time, we're also documenting a profound transition from an area that was established essentially for a residential function to an area that's become more diverse and which is has both residential and business functions. So some of the transition is much more deep-seated. It's not a superficial transition. It's responding to the growth in sophistication in terms of people's needs and requirements. And this is an example would be some of the more diversified businesses that we're seeing. We've also clearly documented how over time people have made purposeful investments to accommodate business. So from a starting point where every house was simply a residential dwelling, you can observe over time how people put money to transform their house into a mixed use. And then, of course, population dynamics will always have an impact on the township economy. And in the spatial distribution maps you've seen, if a settlement grows in size, you will always get new businesses responding to those niches. So it's a combination of factors, and it's a mixed bag in terms of, yes, there is clearly evidence of entrepreneurial growth and success, but at the same time, when an economy suffers, all businesses, formal or informal, are affected by that impact.
All right, a final question before we wind down the recording, although I have a number of questions that we'll jump into after that. When we think about the idea of as an organization like Rotary, or as individual clubs within an organization like Rotary, the idea of being helpful and serving in some fashion people in areas where they are living day to day. This idea of subsistence income, can we sell enough to be able to buy the food that we need, et cetera. Did you find any evidence or even anecdotal stories about the effect of charitable efforts, service efforts of any kind in areas like South Delft, where you did the study?
Yes, we do see a number of examples of charitable efforts. Most of these efforts tend to just focus on a service-driven approach. There's often a disconnection between the provision of services and often the intention behind those services and the need to stimulate local economic development and local economic growth. So I think my call has really been to say that gap needs to narrow. Yes, of course, it's very important to address the backlog in services and to provide certain kinds of aid these types of communities, but as much as possible to do it through an approach that can be stimulating the local economy, that can be encouraging opportunities for local entrepreneurs, whether it be in fixing facilities or in selling items, or in distributing goods to people who require those goods.
All right. Well, I look forward to our conversation continuing in a few moments. But for all of you who have been watching this, members of the Rotary eClub of Silicon Valley and guests from Rotary clubs and other groups around the world, we thank you for joining our meeting this week and watching this recording. If you are in the meeting, please continue to scroll down and do two things. One is to let us know you were here. There is an attendance piece, and Rotarians, by filling that out properly, you will get an email that you can pass along to your club secretary in order to make up a miss so that you can keep your 100% attendance and strive to get that weekly dose of energy that comes from figuring out how we can make the world a better place in ways small and large. Farther down, you'll see our forum, the Discuss section, and you are very welcome to leave a comment or to leave comments to those who have left comments. And that is one of the ways that in an asynchronous online club, we develop conversations with each other, and we welcome your participation. As we always like to do, we hand it back to the speaker for a final word. Andrew, if you would, go ahead and finish us off.
I think my key message is that micro enterprises are extremely important and can and are playing a very central role in addressing poverty and enabling people to progress and uplift their lives.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew, and we will see you next week.